The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Prince George walked slowly along the stone pathway. At 15 years old, he had grown taller than most expected, his once chubby cheeks now showing the sharp angles that hinted at the man he would become. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on his young shoulders, making each step feel deliberate and measured. Just 3 weeks ago, his world had changed forever. His beloved great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind a legacy that seemed impossible to fill. George remembered the last conversation he had with her, sitting in her private study as she shared stories about duty, service, and the quiet moments that truly mattered in royal life. "Remember, George," she had said, her voice still strong despite her 96 years, "true leadership isn't about grand gestures or public speeches. It's about the small acts of kindness and respect that no one sees coming." Those words echoed in his mind now as he approached the East Terrace, where he knew Sergeant Major James Mitchell would be standing at his usual post. For 8 years, Mitchell had been part of the Queen's Guard, a man whose dedication and quiet strength had caught George's attention during countless formal ceremonies and private family gatherings. Mitchell stood perfectly still, his red uniform immaculate, his black bearskin hat positioned exactly as regulations demanded. At 42, he was a career soldier who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq before earning his position at the palace. His weathered hands gripped his rifle with the same steady confidence that had made him a respected leader among his fellow guards. George had learned about Mitchell's story through whispered conversations with palace staff. The sergeant major had lost his own son in a car accident 2 years earlier, a tragedy that had nearly broken him. Yet he continued to serve with unwavering dedication, finding purpose in protecting the royal family during his own darkest hours. As George approached, he noticed something different about Mitchell's posture. Though still maintaining his professional stance, there was a slight tremor in the man's hands, and his eyes, usually focused straight ahead, seemed distant and troubled. The young prince had developed an ability to read people's emotions, a skill his mother had helped him cultivate as preparation for his future role. "Good morning, Sergeant Major Mitchell," George said quietly, stopping a few feet away from the guard's position. Mitchell's eyes flickered toward the prince, and for just a moment, his military composure slipped. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," he replied, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there in previous encounters. George had been thinking about this moment for days. He had learned from palace records that today marked the 2nd anniversary of Mitchell's son's death, a fact that most people in the castle either didn't know or had forgotten in the bustle of royal duties. The prince had also discovered that Mitchell had requested to be assigned to this particular post today, a quiet corner of the castle grounds where he could serve while privately remembering his lost child. "I wanted to thank you," George began, his voice still adjusting to the deeper tones of adolescence. "Not just for your service to my family, but for the way you've shown strength during difficult times." Mitchell's grip on his rifle tightened almost imperceptibly. He was trained to remain silent during duty hours, to blend into the background like a living statue. But something in the young prince's tone made him look directly at George for the first time in their brief conversation. "Your Royal Highness." Mitchell started, then stopped. Clearly struggling with protocol and emotion, George stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Mitchell could hear. "I know what today is, Sergeant Major. I know about Thomas." The mention of his son's name hit Mitchell like a physical blow. His carefully maintained composure cracked, and for a moment, the proud soldier was just a grieving father, standing in the shadow of a castle, fighting back tears that had been building for 2 years. George had spent weeks learning about Thomas Mitchell, a bright 7-year-old boy who had loved football and dreamed of becoming a soldier like his father. The accident had happened on a rainy evening, as the family returned from Thomas's school play. A drunk driver had run a red light, changing everything in an instant. "He would have been 9 today," Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. The prince nodded solemnly. He had arranged for this conversation to happen during a shift change, when the East Terrace would be temporarily empty of other staff members. This moment belonged to them alone, away from the formal protocols that usually governed every interaction within the palace walls. "I've been thinking about something my great-grandmother told me," George continued, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that made him look older than his 15 years. She said that real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every morning and choosing to serve others, even when your own heart is broken. Mitchell's eyes glistened with unshed tears. In all his years of military service, he had faced enemy fire, lost comrades in battle, and endured the rigorous training that forged him into an elite soldier. But standing here, listening to a teenage prince acknowledge his pain with such genuine understanding, he felt more vulnerable than he had in years. "Thomas was proud of you," George said softly. "I read the letter he wrote to Santa last Christmas. He wanted to grow up to be brave and strong like his daddy." The letter had been found in police records from the accident scene, a crumpled piece of paper that had survived the crash. George's private secretary had obtained a copy through official channels, part of the prince's effort to understand the people who dedicated their lives to protecting his family. Mitchell's military training warred with his human emotions. He wanted to maintain his professional distance, to fulfill his duty without letting personal grief interfere with his responsibilities. But the young prince's words had found their way past all his carefully constructed defenses. "He drew pictures of soldiers," Mitchell said, his voice thick with emotion. "Said he wanted to guard the Queen just like me." George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden soldier, hand-painted in the colors of the Queen's Guard. "I had this made," he said, offering it to Mitchell. "So Thomas can still be here with you, even during the long shifts." The gesture was simple, but its impact was profound. Mitchell stared at the small figure, seeing in its painted face a reflection of his son's innocent dreams and boundless admiration. His hands shook as he accepted the gift, protocol forgotten in the face of such unexpected kindness. "Your Royal Highness, Mitchell struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude. "You don't have to say anything," George replied gently. "Just know that your service matters, and your sacrifice is seen." As the prince prepared to continue his walk through the gardens, Mitchell straightened his shoulders and returned to his formal posture. But now the wooden soldier was tucked safely in his uniform pocket, a tangible reminder that he wasn't alone in his grief. George walked away slowly, his mind already turning to the next phase of what he had begun to think of as his quiet mission. Over the past 3 weeks, he had been observing the people who worked tirelessly to maintain the royal household, noting their personal struggles and unspoken burdens. His great-grandmother's death had awakened something in him, a desire to lead not just through ceremony and tradition, but through genuine human connection. The conversation with Mitchell was only the beginning. George had learned that true leadership required more than birthright or formal training. It demanded the courage to see people as individuals, to acknowledge their pain, and to offer comfort without expecting anything in return. As he reached the castle's main entrance, George paused to look back at the east terrace. Mitchell stood at his post, once again the picture of military precision. But the young prince knew that beneath that stoic exterior, a healing process had begun, one that would ultimately change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. 3 days had passed since Prince George's conversation with Sergeant Major Mitchell, and the young royal found himself thinking constantly about their encounter. He had noticed subtle changes in Mitchell's demeanor during subsequent sightings, a slightly straighter posture, a hint of warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The wooden soldier remained tucked in Mitchell's uniform pocket, a secret symbol of their shared understanding. George had spent those 3 days researching military protocols and the complex hierarchy that governed the palace guard system. What he discovered both impressed and troubled him. Mitchell was widely respected among his fellow guards, known for his fairness, dedication, and unwavering commitment to duty. Yet the man was struggling in ways that his superiors either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The prince had also learned something that changed everything. Mitchell had submitted a formal request for early retirement, citing personal reasons. The paperwork sat on Colonel Harrison's desk, awaiting approval. If granted, Mitchell would leave the Royal Guard within a month, ending a distinguished career that had spanned nearly 2 decades. George understood the real reason behind the retirement request. The daily reminders of duty and service, once sources of pride and purpose, had become painful echoes of the values he had tried to instill in his son. Every morning in uniform felt like a betrayal of his grief, and every ceremonial duty reminded him of Thomas's admiration for his father's noble profession. The prince knew he needed to act, but his approach would require careful consideration. Direct intervention in military personnel matters was beyond his authority and could create complications for everyone involved. Instead, he decided to focus on something more subtle but potentially more powerful, creating an opportunity for Mitchell to rediscover his sense of purpose. George's plan began with a conversation with his private secretary, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, a woman whose discretion and efficiency had made her invaluable to the royal family for over 15 years. In her modest office overlooking the castle courtyard, George explained his observations about Mitchell's situation without revealing the personal details of their previous conversation. "I believe Sergeant Major Mitchell would benefit from a special assignment," George said carefully, choosing his words to maintain Mitchell's privacy while conveying the urgency of the situation. Mrs. Pemberton studied the prince with sharp, intelligent eyes. She had watched George grow from a playful child into a thoughtful young man, and she recognized the determination in his voice that reminded her so much of his great-grandmother. "What did you have in mind, Your Royal Highness?" "The annual memorial service for fallen soldiers," George replied. "I'd like to suggest that Mitchell be chosen to represent the Queen's Guard in laying the commemorative wreath." The service was held each year at Westminster Abbey, honoring soldiers who had died in service to the crown. It was considered one of the most prestigious assignments a guard could receive, carrying both symbolic weight and personal significance. The chosen guard would march alone down the Abbey's central aisle, carrying a wreath that represented the sacrifice of countless brave men and women. Mrs. Pemberton made a note in her leather-bound planner. "I'll speak with Colonel Harrison about the selection process. May I ask what brought Sergeant Major Mitchell to your attention?" Well, George had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that was truthful without being revealing. "I've observed his dedication during various ceremonies. He demonstrates the kind of quiet strength and dignity that should be recognized." What George didn't mention was the extensive research he had conducted into Mitchell's military record. The sergeant major had earned several commendations during his tours overseas, including a citation for bravery after he risked his life to rescue wounded comrades during an ambush in Afghanistan. He had also received recognition for his mentorship of younger soldiers, many of whom credited Mitchell with helping them develop both military skills and personal confidence. After his meeting with Mrs. Pemberton, George walked through the castle corridors with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his great-grandmother's death. He paused at a window overlooking the gardens where he had first spoken with Mitchell, remembering the Queen's words about leadership through small, unseen acts of kindness. That evening, George sat in his private study, surrounded by books about military history and royal protocol. He was reading about the memorial service tradition when his father, Prince William, knocked on the door. "Working late?" William asked, settling into the chair across from George's desk. "Just reading about our family's military connections," George replied, closing the book but keeping his finger on the relevant page. William noticed the intensity in his son's expression, a look he had seen increasingly often since the Queen's death. "Is there something specific you're researching?" George hesitated, weighing how much to share. He had inherited his great-grandmother's instinct for discretion, but he also valued his father's counsel on matters of leadership and responsibility. "I've been thinking about the people who protect us," George said finally. "How we can better honor their service, especially those who might be struggling with personal challenges." William leaned forward, intrigued by his son's mature perspective. "That's a noble consideration. Did you have something particular in mind?" "The memorial service next month," George explained. "I think it's important that we choose someone whose service truly embodies the values we want to honor." Father and son talked for another hour about duty, service, and the weight of leadership. William was impressed by George's thoughtful approach to his future role, recognizing the influence of the Queen's teachings in his son's developing philosophy. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment 20 miles from the castle, Mitchell sat at his kitchen table, staring at a photograph of Thomas in his school uniform. The boy's gap-toothed smile seemed to illuminate the small room, a reminder of joy that felt increasingly distant with each passing day. Mitchell had been struggling with his decision to leave the Guard. Part of him felt that stepping away from royal service would dishonor both his military career and his son's memory. Thomas had been so proud of his father's position, often bragging to classmates about Daddy's important job protecting the royal family. But the daily routine of standing at attention, of maintaining perfect composure while his heart remained shattered, had become almost unbearable. Every formal ceremony reminded him of his son's excited questions about palace life. Every changing of the guard brought back memories of Thomas's promise to visit Daddy at work when he was old enough. The wooden soldier from Prince George sat on the table beside Thomas's photograph. Mitchell picked it up, turning it over in his weathered hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly made by someone who understood both the significance of the gesture and the pain it was meant to address. In his years of military service, Mitchell had received many awards and commendations, but none had touched him as deeply as this simple gift from a 15-year-old prince who had taken the time to acknowledge his loss and honor his son's memory. The next morning brought unexpected news. Colonel Harrison summoned Mitchell to his office, a formal meeting that sent ripples of anxiety through the sergeant major's already troubled thoughts. As he walked through the castle corridors toward the colonel's office, Mitchell wondered if his request for early retirement had been processed, if his military career was about to officially come to an end. Colonel Harrison was a stern man in his late 50s, whose own distinguished service record commanded respect throughout the palace guard. He had served in multiple conflicts and understood the toll that military life could take on soldiers and their families. "Sergeant Major Mitchell," the colonel began, gesturing for Mitchell to take a seat across from his desk. "I have a special assignment to discuss with you." Mitchell felt a flutter of surprise. Special assignments were typically reserved for soldiers who were advancing in their careers, not for those seeking early retirement. "The annual memorial service at Westminster Abbey," Colonel Harrison continued. "I'm recommending you to represent the Queen's Guard in the wreath-laying ceremony." The words hit Mitchell like a physical shock. The memorial service was one of the most honored traditions in the royal military calendar. A solemn ceremony that paid tribute to soldiers who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Being chosen to lay the commemorative wreath was considered the highest honor a guard could receive. "Sir, I'm honored by the consideration," Mitchell managed, his voice thick with emotion. "But I should mention that I've submitted a request for early retirement." Colonel Harrison nodded gravely. "I'm aware of your request, Sergeant Major. I'm also aware that you've been through tremendous personal difficulties. This assignment isn't just about your military record, though that record is exemplary. It's about recognizing the strength you've shown in continuing to serve others while facing your own darkest hours." Mitchell felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. The irony wasn't lost on him. Being chosen to honor fallen soldiers while contemplating abandoning his own service seemed almost cruel. "The ceremony is in 3 weeks," the colonel continued. "If you accept this assignment, I'd like to postpone processing your retirement request until afterward. You don't have to make any permanent decisions today, but I hope you'll consider what this opportunity represents." As Mitchell walked back to his quarters, his mind raced with conflicting emotions. The honor of representing his fellow guards in such a significant ceremony was undeniable, but it also felt like a test of his resolve to leave military life behind. He thought about Thomas, wondering what his son would have wanted him to do. That afternoon, as Mitchell resumed his post at the East Terrace, he noticed Prince George approaching from the same direction as their previous encounter. The young royal walked with purpose, but there was something different about his demeanor. A quiet confidence that seemed to have grown stronger over the past few days. "Good afternoon, Sergeant Major Mitchell," George said, stopping at a respectful distance. "Good afternoon, Your Royal Highness," Mitchell replied, his voice carrying new uncertainty about his future with the Royal Guard. "I heard about your special assignment," George said quietly. "Congratulations." Mitchell looked at the prince with surprise. News of military assignments typically didn't reach the royal family unless they specifically requested updates on personnel matters. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," Mitchell said carefully. "It's quite an honor," George nodded solemnly. "My great-grandmother always said that some honors choose us, rather than the other way around. She believed that when we're called to serve in a particular way, it's usually because we're exactly the right person for that moment." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Mitchell sensed that this conversation, like their previous encounter, was more than a casual exchange between a royal and a guard. There was intention behind the prince's words, a message that went deeper than surface pleasantries. "Sometimes the most important service we provide comes when we least expect it," George continued. "When we're struggling with our own challenges but choose to honor others anyway." Mitchell felt a profound shift in his understanding of his situation. The memorial service wasn't just a military assignment, it was an opportunity to transform his grief into something meaningful, to honor not just fallen soldiers but also his own son's memory through continued service. As Prince George continued his walk through the gardens, Mitchell remained at his post with a new sense of purpose beginning to take root in his heart. The wooden soldier in his pocket seemed to carry extra weight now, a reminder that some gifts are meant to guide us toward unexpected paths of healing and renewal. The morning of the memorial service dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of Westminster Abbey. Sergeant Major Mitchell stood in the preparation room adjacent to the main sanctuary. His dress uniform pressed to perfection, his medals aligned with military precision. But beneath his composed exterior, his heart thundered with a mixture of honor, anxiety, and profound emotion. Over the past 3 weeks, Mitchell had thrown himself into preparation for this moment with an intensity that surprised even his fellow guards. He had studied every aspect of the ceremony, practiced the precise timing of his march down the Abbey's central aisle, and rehearsed the solemn ritual of placing the commemorative wreath. More importantly, he had begun to understand what this assignment truly meant, not just for his military career, but for his journey through grief and toward renewed purpose. Prince George arrived at Westminster Abbey an hour before the ceremony, accompanied by his parents and other members of the royal family. As he walked through the ancient corridors, he felt the weight of tradition and the presence of countless generations who had gathered in this sacred space to honor, sacrifice, and service. The prince had spent the previous evening in quiet reflection, thinking about his great-grandmother's teachings and the ripple effects of small acts of compassion. His decision to bring Mitchell's situation to Colonel Harrison's attention had set events in motion that extended far beyond what he had initially imagined. What George hadn't known when he first spoke with Mrs. Pemberton was that Colonel Harrison had been considering recommending Mitchell for early medical retirement due to concerns about the sergeant major's emotional well-being. Several senior guards had quietly reported their worries about their colleague's state of mind, noting his increasing isolation and visible struggle with grief. The memorial service assignment had changed everything. Instead of processing Mitchell's retirement request, the colonel had watched with growing admiration as the sergeant major transformed his preparation for the ceremony into a process of personal healing and professional renewal. Mitchell had begun visiting the graves of soldiers who had died under his command during overseas deployments, placing small stones on their headstones in accordance with military tradition. He had also started volunteering at a local veteran support group, sharing his experiences with other soldiers who were struggling with loss and trauma. Most significantly, he had written a letter to his late son, a practice suggested by the group counselor, explaining his decision to continue serving and honoring Thomas's memory through dedication to protecting others. The letter remained in his uniform pocket alongside Prince George's wooden soldier, both serving as sources of strength during difficult moments. As the Abbey filled with dignitaries, military personnel, and family members of fallen soldiers, Mitchell took his position at the rear of the sanctuary. The commemorative wreath sat on a small table nearby, its red poppies and white lilies arranged in a circle that symbolized eternal remembrance and hope for peace. Prince George, seated in the front row with his family, found his eyes drawn repeatedly to Mitchell's tall figure. The sergeant major stood with renewed confidence, his bearing reflecting not just military discipline, but genuine purpose. The broken man George had encountered 3 weeks ago had been replaced by someone who had discovered how to transform pain into service. The ceremony began with the haunting notes of a military trumpet playing "The Last Post," the traditional bugle call that honored fallen soldiers. As the final note faded into silence, the Abbey's vast space seemed to hold the collective breath of everyone present. Archbishop Williams stepped forward to deliver the opening prayer, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls as he spoke about sacrifice, remembrance, and the debt owed to those who had given their lives in service to their country. His words carried particular weight for Mitchell, who had seen firsthand the cost of military service and the families torn apart by loss. When the moment came for the wreath-laying ceremony, Colonel Harrison announced Mitchell's name and briefly outlined his service record. The recitation of his accomplishments, tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, commendations for bravery, years of distinguished service to the Royal Guard felt surreal to Mitchell as he stepped forward. But as he lifted the commemorative wreath from its stand, Mitchell felt a profound shift in his understanding of what he was doing. This wasn't just about following military protocol or fulfilling an assigned duty. He was carrying the hopes and grief of every family who had lost someone in service, including his own family's loss, even though Thomas had died in a civilian accident. The walk down the Abbey's central aisle felt both eternal and instantaneous. Mitchell's polished boots echoed against the stone floor, each step measured and deliberate. He was acutely aware of the hundreds of people watching, but his focus remained fixed on the altar ahead, where a simple stone marker represented all those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Prince George watched with intense emotion as Mitchell approached the altar. The young royal could see the transformation that had taken place in the sergeant major, the way he carried himself with renewed dignity, the sense of purpose that radiated from his movements. This was no longer a man seeking escape from his pain, but someone who had learned to channel that pain into something meaningful and healing. As Mitchell knelt to place the wreath at the base of the memorial, a profound silence settled over the Abbey. In that moment, he silently spoke to his son, telling Thomas that his daddy was continuing to serve, continuing to protect others, and carrying the boy's memory forward through dedication to duty and compassion for those in need. The wreath settled into place with quiet finality, its circular shape creating a frame around the memorial marker. Mitchell remained kneeling for a moment longer than protocol required, his head bowed in prayer or reflection. When he finally rose and stepped back, there wasn't a dry eye among the military personnel present. Archbishop Williams concluded the ceremony with a blessing that spoke to the continuation of service beyond individual loss, the way honor and sacrifice create ripples that extend through generations. His final words, "Their service endures in those who carry on their mission," seemed to speak directly to Mitchell's situation and his decision to remain with the Royal Guard. After the official ceremony concluded, Mitchell found himself surrounded by fellow guards and military officers who wanted to congratulate him on the dignity and emotion he had brought to the wreath-laying. Several senior officers mentioned that they had rarely seen such a moving performance of the ceremony, noting how Mitchell's personal investment in the moment had elevated the entire service. But the most meaningful interaction came as Mitchell was preparing to leave the Abbey. Prince George approached him in a quiet corridor, away from the crowds and formal protocols that usually governed their encounters. "Sergeant Major Mitchell," George began, his voice carrying new maturity that reflected his own growth over the past month. "Your Royal Highness," Mitchell replied, straightening to attention despite the informal setting. "I wanted to thank you," George continued, "not just for today's ceremony, but for showing me what real courage looks like." Mitchell looked puzzled. "I'm not sure I understand, sir. You taught me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose to keep serving others when our own hearts are broken," George explained. "That's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." The prince reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope. "This came for you yesterday. It's from the family of Private Jonathan Wells." Mitchell recognized the name immediately, a young soldier who had served under his command in Afghanistan and who had died in an improvised explosive device attack. Mitchell had written a letter to Wells's family after the funeral, trying to convey how much their son had meant to his fellow soldiers. With trembling hands, Mitchell opened the envelope and read the handwritten note inside. Wells's mother had written to thank him for his letter and to tell him that the family would be watching the memorial service on television. She wanted him to know that they considered him part of their extended family and that they were proud to see him representing their son's memory in such an important ceremony. "They wanted you to know," George added quietly, "that Jonathan's little sister is now studying to become a military nurse. She says she wants to help soldiers the way you helped her brother." The impact of those words on Mitchell was immediate and profound. He realized that his service hadn't ended with his son's death. It had taken on new meaning and purpose. Through his continued dedication, he was inspiring others to serve, creating a legacy that extended far beyond his own personal loss. 3 months later, Colonel Harrison received a formal letter from Sergeant Major Mitchell. Instead of a retirement request, it was an application for advancement training that would prepare him for a teaching position at the Royal Military Academy. Mitchell wanted to train the next generation of guards, sharing not just military skills but the deeper understanding of service that he had gained through his journey through grief. Prince George, now 16 and increasingly involved in royal duties, often walked past the East Terrace where he first encountered Mitchell. The sergeant major was no longer assigned to that post, having been promoted to a training position within the palace guard. But their brief relationship had created lasting changes in both their lives. George had learned that true leadership required more than ceremonial knowledge or public speaking skills. It demanded the ability to see people as individuals, to recognize their struggles and strengths, and to create opportunities for growth and healing. These lessons would serve him well as he prepared for his future role as king. Mitchell had discovered that grief didn't have to be the end of purpose. It could be the beginning of a deeper understanding of service and sacrifice. His work training young guards included discussions about handling personal challenges while maintaining professional duties, helping soldiers develop resilience and emotional strength alongside their military skills. The wooden soldier that Prince George had given Mitchell remained in a place of honor on his desk, a reminder of the moment when a young royal's compassion had helped redirect a grieving father's life toward renewed purpose. Next to it sat a photograph of Thomas in his school uniform, smiling with the gap-toothed grin that had once seemed lost forever, but now served as inspiration for continued service. The final testament to their encounter came during Prince George's 18th birthday celebration. As part of the ceremony, he was presented with his first official military commission. When asked to choose a personal aide for future military functions, George requested Sergeant Major Mitchell, now holding the rank of Regimental Sergeant Major, and serving as head instructor for Palace Guard training. Standing together during the commission ceremony, the young prince and the seasoned soldier represented the enduring power of compassion, service, and the quiet moments that transform lives. Their story had begun with a simple act of recognition and evolved into a lasting partnership that would influence the royal guard for generations to come. As Prince George accepted his commission, he remembered his great-grandmother's words about leadership through small, unseen acts of kindness. Looking at Mitchell standing proudly beside him, George understood that some of the most important work of leadership happens in quiet conversations, private gestures, and the simple recognition that every person's pain and potential matter. The ceremony concluded with the traditional playing of God Save the King, but for George and Mitchell, the music carried additional meaning, a reminder that true service to crown and country begins with service to each other, and that the strongest foundations of leadership are built on understanding, compassion, and the courage to help others find their way through darkness toward renewed light.